Hi, it's Dennis Daly. Mention the name Fred Foy, and people automatically think of the most dramatic open and closing in the history of broadcasting for the Lone Ranger.
The Lone Ranger, a copyrighted feature of the Lone Ranger Incorporated, is produced by Trendle Campbell Muir Incorporated. The part of the Lone Ranger is played by Brace Beamer. Your announcer, Fred Foy.
Like most baby boomers, I first heard Fred Foy as the narrator announcer for the Lone Ranger. But after the run of that series, he would join the staff of ABC in New York, doing some wonderful booth announcing for ABC television, even being Dick Cabot's announcer. But he also did newscasts and narrations for ABC Radio, and some very special programs, including a 13-week series called The Eagle and the Bear. I'm happy that I found one of those shows recently in my archive. It's show number 4, dealing with the Berlin Airlift and that crisis from the 1950s, presented here on YouTube in 2 parts. So sit back, turn out the lights, close your eyes, and listen to the other Fred Foy and The Eagle and the Bear.
Russia was waging war upon the West, a Cold War, a war of nerves. As spring came in the year of 1948, there would be a test of the nerves of the West. Winston Churchill, always a man of words, ever the man of history, called on the West to gird itself for the long struggle.
The situation has been well described by distinguished Americans as the Cold War. And the question is asked, are we winning the Cold War? We seek nothing from Russia but goodwill and fair play. If, however, there is to be a war of nerves, let us make sure that our nerves are strong.
Strong nerves would be needed, and would be put to the test in the city of Berlin. Berlin, the capital of a Germany crushed by the Allied powers of World War II. In 1948, a divided city. Berlin, split into 4 zones of military occupation: French, British, American, and Russian. A divided city within a divided country. Berlin, more than 100 miles behind the Iron Curtain. The story of post-war Berlin was one of crisis. In the final days of Hitler, the Russians seized the city. In July, the British and Americans took possession of their zones of occupation, and with Russia, set up the Allied command for the city. But late in 1945, it was clear that Russia had her own plans for Berlin. In October, Russian was made a mandatory language for study in East Berlin schools. In February 1946, communists took over a Free German Youth meeting in Berlin. August, a communist government was set up in the Eastern Zone. Berlin was to be made over in Moscow's image. October 1946, elections for the Berlin Municipal Council. The Communists win only 26 of 130 seats on the council. June 1947, the Berlin Municipal Council elects Professor Ernst Reuter as mayor of Berlin. Russia vetoes Reuter's election. Clearly, if Russia cannot have her way, she won't play the game. November 1947, the Big Four meet in London to discuss German reunification. To the London conference goes Secretary of State George C. Marshall. Marshall, whose name has been given to the European Recovery Program for the rebuilding of a shattered Europe. Marshall, architect of the military victories of the Second World War, hopes for an end to the division of Germany. Marshall's hopes are dashed by the stony-faced opposition of Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. Marshall returns to America and reports to the nation.
We cannot look forward to a unified Germany at this time. We must do the best we can in the area where our influence can be felt. All must recognize that the difficulties to be overcome are immense. The problems concerned with the treaty settlements for Italy and the satellite countries were simple by comparison, since none of those countries were divided into zones of occupation, and all of them had existing form of government.
At the beginning of 1948, Russia was showing her hand in Germany. New restrictions are imposed on automobile traffic between Berlin and the East Zone of Germany. In February, the Russians order a 20% cut in the number of travel permits issued for cargo trucks between Berlin and the western half of Germany. The writing is on the wall. March 20th, Soviet Marshal Sokolovsky walks out of the Allied Control Council. The 29th of March, Russia announces that permits will be required for Allied troop movements from the west into Berlin. Russia tells the Western powers that they have no right of free access to Berlin. But Harry S. Truman has other ideas about Western rights. Truman talks of American aims.
We seek no territorial expansion or selfish advantage. We have no plans for aggression against any other state, large or small. We have no objective which need clash with the peaceful aims of any other nation. The United States has been conscientious and consistent in its devotion to these principles. We have sought to assist free nations in creating economic conditions under which free institutions can survive and flourish. We have sought, through the United Nations, the development of a world order in which each nation feels secure under law and can make its contribution to world civilization in accordance with its own means and national tradition. We have sought to help free nations protect themselves against aggression. We know that peace through weakness has proved to be a dangerous illusion.
June 23rd, 1948. The gathering crisis over Berlin comes to a head. Because of technical difficulties, the Russians cut off all passenger and freight traffic to Berlin. By the 1st of July, all highway, rail, and river traffic into and out of Berlin was cut off. The gates to Berlin swung shut. Berlin, a city of more than 2 million people, was completely cut off from the Western world. Or was it? While the Soviets cut off the land and water routes to Berlin, Allied aircraft were still flying through the air corridors from the west to Berlin's Tempelhof Airport. While the gates were shut by the Russian bear on the ground, the Eagles were still flying, but no one knew whether the Russians would try to interfere with the flights. It became a major crisis, a face-to-face confrontation between Eagle and Bear. In Washington, the lights burned late at the White House. Harry S. Truman faced the post-war's gravest crisis. There were some, including General Lucius Clay, the American commander in Berlin, who urged Truman to send an armored train into Berlin. It would be a calculated risk. It might work. Or it might set off the Third World War. If war came, Berlin would be lost, and probably all of Europe. West Berlin would have to be saved. But there had to be another way. Truman decides that the freedom of Berlin may depend upon the wings of eagles. $13,000 tons of food and fuel. That was what West Berliners needed. On hand in the middle of June was enough food for 36 days. Enough fuel for 45 days.
Roger, Big 84-5, I'll have your clearance. Standard clearance of Tempelhof Range Station, 5,000 feet. Clearance for rolling takeoff, service when calm, over.
In the Old Testament it is written, "They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary." But 13,000 tons of supplies a day? Surely that was impossible. All the world looked with dismay at the challenge thrown down by the Russian Bear. A city of 2 million people at the mercy of a Soviet blockade.
Now jump to part 2 and hear the marvelous narration by the great Fred Foy.